Thank you, Beth, for that kind introduction. I'd like to start out by thanking Ute Lotz-Heumann for the original invitation, which I think came a week or two before COVID visited us. Good timing. I'm glad to be here finally. Thanks to Beth Plummer and your colleagues for the great reception. It was a pleasure to meet the graduate students. Welcome you in the select studio audience and you thousands of viewers at home. The talk will be about 45 minutes, and that should give us time for discussion at the end, and I hope you have some things you'd like to talk about. So let me start out. Clicker, here it is. The medieval or Gothic executioner appears to be a permanent fixture of modern culture. We all know the image, a black hooded, possibly shirtless, anonymous goon who often takes sadistic pleasure in his grisly work of torture and execution. Only during the past few decades have scholarly studies themselves fully escaped the gravitational pull of this stereotype, and even these impressive works have been no match in the public arena for this formidable public icon. It's not going forward. She said sometimes you have to start out by doing it manually. Okay, I'll try it again. Like pirates, witches, and other historical outcasts, executioners have been reclaimed by romance and fantasy writers for dramatic purposes, by cartoonists for comical purposes, and by filmmakers and other purveyors of popular culture for commercial purposes. Many modern European cities regularly exploit this popular stereotype with historical criminal tours. I don't know if anybody's been on one of those, to dungeons and other sites, and even a medieval criminal museum in the premier German historical reenactment city of Rothenburg ob der Tauber. The intellectual caliber of these representations, which I can't claim I've systematically surveyed, ranges from modestly informative to harmless amusement to historical vandalism in the service of profit, at worst contributing to the pornography of suffering and death that already saturates modern culture. Whatever factual information is conveyed, the Middle Ages in general and pre-modern executioners in particular remain profoundly alien, even comical, in their superstitions and grisly punishments. Like all cultural icons, this figure has a history, and that history tells us more about subsequent modern preoccupations than it does about historical executioners themselves. And I did, as Beth said, I wrote a book about a historical executioner, which I can talk about later. But today, and this is my main argument, what I'm going to say is most of what we've come to believe about medieval and early modern executioners actually comes from the European imaginations of the long 19th century, and most of it's wrong. And I think you could say a lot, in some cases, about the Middle Ages in general. A lot of the popular ideas about the Middle Ages are 19th century fantasies and often misleading. They drive historians crazy. In historical fact, such individuals were indeed universally scorned and ostracized, particularly before the 16th century. But popular disgust focused much more on the dishonorable nature of their work, particularly because they dealt with dead bodies, like grave diggers and tanners, than it did, and much more so than any cruelty, or to use an anachronism, sadism. Executioners were also hardly anonymous. There were no masks. So if you don't remember anything else from this lecture, you can tell people executioners did not wear masks. Everybody knew who they were. Many were were typically dressed in fine clothes, and by the 17th century, many wore military uniforms. This is Franz Schmidt, the executioner I wrote about. And this is a picture from a chronicle, and you'll see this doesn't really fit that first stereotype at all. He dresses, these are very expensive clothing. I love the pink stockings especially. Those were considered very manly in the era. It's a public performance, and he dresses up for the occasion. Everyone at the time acknowledged a certain degree of technical skill involved in the various forms of execution employed, especially beheading by the sword. And this is by the sword. Typically, the condemned is either sitting or kneeling or standing. Am I still on? Yep. And standing is the most difficult for the executioner because they move around. But this is still difficult because these swords, and I've lifted these swords, they're really heavy. And it was hard for me to just hold it, let alone hit the exact place in the neck where they have to do it. So there is some technical expertise, which I talk about in my book. So in other words, executioners were considered artisans of dishonorable trades, again, like gravediggers, social outcasts, sometimes feared for their supposed supernatural powers, but rarely seen as evil or cruel men. That's part of the 19th century. The modern invention of the medieval executioner was the product of three overlapping developments, probably more, but I'm going to focus on three. Beginning in the late 18th century, so the late 1700s, and mostly complete by the beginning of the 20th century. The first crucial element was the transformation of criminal law in general, and of torture and capital punishment in particular. The 18th century is the big reform of criminal law. It's a well-known story, so I'll simply summarize how by the mid-18th century, not just the efficacy, but the humaneness of interrogatory torture, legal torture, and public executions was under question by a variety of Enlightenment thinkers and legal reformers. The English Bill of Rights in 1689, the century before, was the first document to use the phrase cruel and unusual punishment. But the concept was already current, especially among lawyers. During the Enlightenment, virtually every major thinker and author came out against judicial torture. This is the most common example of judicial torture. It's called the Strapato. And the subject is got their hands tied behind the back and then they're slowly pulled up so the shoulder dislocates and they put different levels of weights. And there's always somebody there, not in this picture, writing down what they say. So this is considered legal torture after certain evidence has been accumulated that gives them the right to do this. Obviously not a good thing, not something we would approve of. There are many types of execution, which I also could talk about later. This is one I think is especially bad. It's called execution by the wheel. And this is for murderers and especially serial murderers. So the worst of the worst. And the subject is staked out. And then they put little wooden slats under all the joints. And then the executioner gradually breaks every bone. And if they want to extend it, they do it from the bottom up, so it lasts as long as possible. If they want to have mercy, they do what they call the coup de grace, the hit of grace on the neck, and they break the neck and the person dies, and then they still go along and break the body. This is a terrible, terrible thing. It took maybe up to an hour sometimes. So these are things that legal reformers in the 18th century said, this is barbaric, and it's hard to argue with that. This is actually interesting because Franz Schmidt here is executing his own brother-in-law. Yeah, that's a story in itself. I'll have to hold off on that. Voltaire typically associated the practice most with the infamous Catholic Church. You know, he was a big enemy of the Catholic Church, even though secular authorities everywhere regularly made use of torture and public executions. According to one count, the philosophe used the term Inquisition more than 400 times in some 70 works over the course of half a century. So this is where the executioner in all the Inquisition tends to be the symbol of backwardness and barbarism of the Middle Ages. The discernible turning point was the 1764 publication of Cesare Bakaria's Essays on Crime and Punishment. This is the original version, the Italian version. And this is a huge bestseller. It immediately gets translated in all the different languages. It's Essays on Crime and Punishment, which made the most coherent argument yet for legal reform. Jurists had long doubted the reliability of evidence attained during torture since at least the time of the European witch craze, about 1550 to 1650. I mean, I tell my students, this is the fact. There were no witches. So these are all forced confessions. These are all not real. At the time of Bakaria's extremely influential tract, only Sweden and Prussia had abolished judicial torture. Over the 70 years following the publication, almost all abolished public executions, deeming such ritualized administering of cruelty remnants of a violent and barbarous past with no place in modern progressive society. Some places got rid of it altogether. Most places moved it inside into out of sight, into a prison courtyard or something like that. And it wasn't until the early 20th century that most places, not all, had abolished capital punishment altogether. Of course, it stayed in some places, such as our own, and came back in others. The individuals who perpetrated such acts, for money no less, were accordingly considered reprehensible figures, symbolizing the backwardness of the European Middle Ages. At the exact same time, the figure of the executioner became a figure of cultural fascination. So this is my second factor. The first is criminal reform. The second is the emergence of the new executioner stereotype, namely the growth of Gothic literature. Like other romantic endeavors, the Gothic novel is often mistakenly viewed as a repudiation of Enlightenment thinking. Certainly many writers expressed deep misapprehension about Enlightenment faith and rationalism, most famously in Mary Wollstonecraft's Frankenstein or Goethe's Faust. Gothic authors did not dispute, however, the Enlightenment's condemnation of human tyranny and shared its most common villains, including guess who? Superstitious monks, depraved aristocrats, money-grubbing merchants, and cruel executioners. Both literary and artistic movements also celebrated nature, although Gothic writers tended to focus on the dark underside and the mystery of the unseen world, as well as the sensationalist aesthetics of obsession, madness, terror, and fear. Fascination with the supernatural and the irrational in turn led to popular late 18th century works, such as Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto in 1764. This was a big hit. And more sensationally, Matthew Gregory Lewis's The Monk in 1796. They provided an emotional texture to Enlightenment beliefs about torture and execution in the bad old days of the Middle Ages. And they've made movies of this. This is actually a movie from 11 years ago. It's an irresistible figure. I'll tell you the story. The central character, the monk and abbot Ambrosio, commits such scandalous deeds, fornication, rape, incest, murder, sorcery, you name it, that eventually the Inquisition has him and his accomplice Matilda arrested and tortured. And again, the Spanish Inquisition, there are all kinds of sensationalist imaginings of this, that this is what it was all about. And the corollary with the actual Inquisition is not precise, to say the least. In The Monk, Lewis describes how the disgraced Ambrosio, and this is a quote, now saw himself stained with the most loathed and monstrous sins. So Gothic literature is not subtle. The object of universal execration, a prisoner of the Holy Office and probably doomed to perish in tortures most severe. And as anticipated, when the treacherous monk is led before the inquisitors, quote, his eyes glanced downward and he perceived various iron instruments lying scattered upon the floor. Their forms are unknown to him, but apprehension immediately guessed them to be engines of torture. As soon as the executioner began his work, Ambrosio, quote, suffered the most excruciating pangs that were ever invented by human cruelty and eventually faints. So you can see why this stuff sells. It's got lots of sensation. After a feverish night of dreams about his own crimes and the torture ahead of him, he breaks down the next morning at the mere sight of the executioner's instruments and makes a full confession. Now terrified of his subsequent burning at the stake, the monk follows his paramour's lead and makes a pact with the devil, only to experience an even more gruesome death, as well as eternal damnation. So if this were a series on Netflix, there would be all the warnings you can imagine at the top about graphic violence and so on. No smoking, though. Lewis was only 19 when he published The Monk and had written the entire work in 10 weeks. So I think of it sort of an undergraduate term paper. Most term papers don't do that well. His lurid tale scandalized England's literary establishment. This is trash, they said. But the book rapidly became a bestseller, going through 3 editions in as many years. The titillating details of Ambrosio's sexual and torture chamber exploits in particular drew the admiration of Lewis's contemporary, you may have heard, the Marquis de Sade, who 3 years later had published a philosophical novel in which the beautiful young heroine falls into the hands of a cruel Madrid inquisitor who subjects her to various barbarous tortures. So these become pretty much the stock villains, inquisitors and executioners. Serious readers scoffed at the convoluted plots, reliance on supernatural phenomena, and implausible characters of the monk and other Gothic potboilers. They're not especially well written. But at the same time, readily accepted their crude characterizations of medieval cruelty, especially in the case of the monk, since it was done by Catholics and foreigners, who we knew were bad already. German and French counterparts, known respectively as Schauerromanen, also shudder novels, and Roman noir, which are black novels. So these are all, again, appealing to that sort of sensibility, appealed more to populist taste, but also likewise bolstered pervasive stereotypes at all levels of society of sadistic, even satanic inquisitors and executioners. In the US, the same historical lesson was provided by Nathaniel Hawthorne and Edgar Allan Poe. And I have a medievalist friend who's taught for a long time, and he says, most people's image of the Middle Ages comes more from the pit and the pendulum than actual history. You know, this kind of dark stuff. I don't know if you know the old movie with Vincent Price. And then later assistance from such experts as Monty Python. So this is the Spanish Inquisition, and she's getting the rack, haha. And Mel Brooks, History of the World. And this, if you've seen this, this is a big musical number, the Inquisition. I'm not going to sing it, but they dance and they sing and make a joke out of it. But it plays on the stereotype that these are just sadistic, cruel people who just want to hurt people. They have no real honorable intentions. The popular Gothic image of the Inquisition in particular, and executioners in general, quickly became part of the broader cultural landscape in early 19th century Europe. The Napoleonic invasion of Spain prompted dramatic productions such as Francisco Cabella y Mesa's 1811 The Inquisition, this is a play, which began with the playwright's blunt denunciation of the continuing work, and it's true, the Inquisition was still existed, of the Inquisition and its, quote, well-maintained rack. Another popular Spanish drama, first staged in 1838 and now little known, denounced the entire tribunal as cruel, hypocritical, and blind, claiming whoever is without crime loses his noble breath and goes to die in the fire unless he lies during torture. And I'm not here to defend the Spanish Inquisition. I'm just saying it was greatly exaggerated as this much bigger force than it actually was. Lewis's Monk was adapted by Edward Loder for his 1855 opera, Raymond and Agnes, and even Verdi included a public execution by the Inquisition in his 1860 Don Carlo. Visual depictions of torture and executions likewise proliferated during the first half of the 19th century, most famously in the drawings of Francisco de Goya from the Napoleonic era, and one 1859 oil painting by the Spaniard Victor Manzano y Mejorda makes use of the same coupling of sex and torture that has served the monks so well. And obviously that still continues with movies today. It's a winning combination. This is an image, and you can see right away there's a naked woman, and they have a bunch of men staring at her, another prisoner watching, tools of torture surrounding them. And you can't really make it out because of these lights, but in the back, there are these sinister, dark priests, you know, sort of like the evil emperor in Star Wars, just extending the torture session. So it's very titillating. You know, it's obviously meant to combine these things. Titled simply A Scene of the Inquisition. As in Gothic fiction, the vaguely medieval setting is dark and shadowy, and the terrorized woman is both highly eroticized and sympathetic. The obviously exploitative and prurient nature of the scene belies the fact that Manzano y Mejorda was not some sensationalist hack, but a highly respected and honored member of the European art establishment, and lots of his works hang today at the Prado. So this is a serious artist who's making use of that stereotype. Portrayals of medieval torture and torturers, in other words, while still shocking, had become mainstream. In pre-unification Germany, rationalist and Gothic depictions of medieval executioners came together with the 1801 publication of the private journal of Meister Franz Schmidt. That's the person I wrote about, Nuremberg's executioner from 1578 to 1618. And Entner based his book on a different manuscript from the one I used. I found a manuscript that's older and has some significant differences from this. He's using a copy, but this was the first time it was published, and it made a big sensation. The editor of this first edition of Schmidt's journal, patrician Johann Martin Friedrich von Entner, was one of the most outspoken and passionate reformers of the imperial city's outdated and draconian legal system, thus returning us to the usefulness of barbaric medieval stereotypes for criminal legal reform. The young nobleman's manifesto, called Thoughts and Recommendations on Nuremberg's Criminal Justice and Administration in 1801, was summed up by the Enlightenment version of the Golden Rule. I like this. As you wish to be executed, so should others be executed. Coming across a manuscript copy of Meister Franz's, quote, long forgotten journal, the legal reformer immediately recognized the perfect foil for his legal modernization agenda. In bringing the work to print, von Entner sought to, quote, rescue Schmidt's book from obscurity, and in the process reveal how brutally the misfortunate were punished at the hands of our rustic Franz. Unlike most authors in his day, however, von Entner carefully distinguished between the cruelties of the old regime and the blamelessness of its servants, such as, quote, old honorable Franz, who acted not according to his own feeling and instinct, but at the orders of those who put the sword in his hand. Now, this is unusual to actually make a sympathetic plea for the executioner, but of course, he's trying to get people to read his book too, so consider that. After finally overcoming municipal censorship, the Nuremberg City Council was not happy to publish this kind of stuff. The impassioned editor made his final corrections to the text, then abruptly died at the age of 37, never to experience the subsequent success of either his publication or proposed legal reform. The most vocal fans of Meister Franz's journal, which I think in hindsight is predictable, were neither the jurists nor the academics that von Entner envisioned, but men of letters. Romantic authors in particular embraced the melodramatic figure of the medieval hangman, an entertaining anachronism in an age of mechanical guillotines and gallows with trapdoors. In an 1810 letter discussing Dante's Inferno and Robespierre, the poet and folklorist Ludwig Achim von Arnim enthusiastically wrote his friends, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, about the well-known annals of the Nuremberg Skinner, so I get it kind of wrong, who executed 500 people, and that's also wrong. Clearly an object of interest for those collectors of grisly folktales. And I hope you've seen the original versions of the Grimm brothers. It's pretty grim. It's lots of violence. Schmidt's journal rapidly made the rounds in the salon and literary circles of German intelligentsia, with a certain Meister Franz even making an appearance in Clement Brentano's popular 1817 play, The Story of the Sturdy Kasperl and the Beautiful Annel, in which the executioner both heals a sick dog, because executioners were thought to have healing powers, and beheads the female protagonist for infanticide. And I looked for images of this play, and the only thing I could find was a Lego version, which they apparently tells the whole story in 11 minutes, which I did not watch. But there they are. Beautiful Annie and sturdy Casper. Even Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the most celebrated German author of the day, embraced the long shunned figure of the hangman, entering into a lengthy personal friendship with the execution of Eger, Karl Huss, who shared the poet's geological interests. So they wrote back and forth about rocks. By the beginning of the century, by the middle of the century, the literary figure of the medieval executioner had become a staple of German historical fiction, most notably in Wilhelm Raabe's historical novella, Das letzte Recht, the Last Law in 1862, and a later work, zum wilden Mann, which is the name of the tavern at the Wild Man. So the third element, first was criminal reform, the second is Gothic literature, was the emergence of crime tourism. And this is something I mentioned at the beginning, particularly in Germany. Nowhere was the romantic figure of the medieval hangman more fervently embraced than in the revitalized Nuremberg of the 19th century, with profound implications for the subsequent stereotype. During the decades following the imperial city's 1806 assimilation by Bavaria, and people in Nuremberg still say that they're occupied by the Bavarians, Nuremberg became internationally famous, not just as a manufacturing dynamo, but as a popular tourist destination. It still is today, really is today. Thanks to the efforts of local folk poets, such as Johann Conrad Goebel and Johann Heinrich Wittchen, the hometown of Albrecht Dürer and Hans Sachs became a powerful symbol of traditional German culture at its most idealized. And this is one reason in the 20th century, Nazis really liked it, because it was considered the most German city. It was symbolic, and that's why they had their rallies there. City fathers of the 19th century Nuremberg were quick to capitalize on this proto-national culture windfall for the city on the Pegnitz. And during the 1830s and 40s, purchased and restored a number of historic sites, including the Albrecht Dürer House, which you can visit today, and which they converted into a museum, and the Germanisches Nationalmuseum, which today is a massive collection of various artworks and other objects illustrating the magnificence of Germanic culture and history. And I asked one of the curators, what does that mean, Germanic culture? He said, we don't know. We just collect whatever people give us. By the time of German unification in 1870, the entire old city of Nuremberg, including all of the surrounding walls and gates, had been completely restored, and Nuremberg stood supreme among cities of the recently proclaimed Second Empire as the embodiment of a proud Nuremberg past. And this is a postcard from 1900. In other words, they created a brand, Nuremberg, the German city, and then they'll take advantage of this for their tourism. Of course, the proud past also had a seamy underside. And here too, Nuremberg's lucrative heritage industry inspired new tourist destinations, including a torture chamber set up in 1857 by local antiquarian Georg Friedrich Goiter in the city's Old Frog Tower prison. And it's not actually the real torture chamber still exists. And you can visit it in the basement of the town hall. It's pretty grisly, but this is set up in somewhere else. Capitalizing on a continuing popular fascination with the figure of the medieval hangman, Goiter's collection of ancient torture devices most famously included the Iron Maiden, a supposedly ancient method of torture and execution employed in a secret court, something like the English Star Chamber. And this, for me, sums up 19th century fantasies. This is where you start to see the hooded people. This is where you see the Iron Maiden. And there's a hole there. I'll tell you about what that's for in a minute. This is all imagined. None of this happened. This is the way they project back on the Middle Ages. Both the Iron Maiden and the secret court were complete fabrications. So here's the second thing I hope you remember. There was no real Iron Maiden. That's all made up. They were all forgeries. Nobody used it that way. Despite scholarly skepticism, Goiter and his tour guides continued to titillate visitors with their tales of condemned men and women crushed to death within the Iron Maiden, their bloody corpses then dropped through a hole into the sewer below. And you can imagine a very animated tour guide telling people all of this with the Iron Maiden there and saying, and people say, ooh, all made up. Despite scholarly skepticism, oh, I already said that. To demonstrate the unassailable factuality of the account, the Iron Maiden was opened to reveal jagged spikes and telltale bloodstains. See, it's real. Following the reliable gasps, spectators' attention was then directed to a hole in the floor of Frog Tower with the sound of running water underneath. The entire romance of medieval cruelties overseen by a hooded executioner, which you know now was not real, proved irresistible to tourists and novelists alike. This is the Goiters, a picture of Goiters' original torture museum in one of the towers. Kissing the maiden even became a popular euphemism for torture. And now I learned that. I thought, how often are people talking about torture? That they're talking about kissing the maiden, but it becomes part of the culture very quickly. Gradually, Iron Maidens began to appear. Suddenly, they found all these Iron Maidens in castles and cities throughout German-speaking lands, sometimes sold to collectors for impressive amounts, sometimes serving as the centerpiece of a new torture museum. All but one of them have since been identified as 19th century forgeries, and even the one that's real was something in the 17th century was actually used for ornamentation. And then later on, people stuck knives in there to make it fit the stereotype. Now that the literary conceit of medieval criminal justice and its executioners have been given tangible form, this supposedly validated historical stereotype could be put to diverse uses. Like other symbols of the European Ancien regime, the medieval hangman and the tools of his trade were ready stand-ins for any despised and backward group. Catholics, if you happen to be Protestant. Royalists, if you're a Republican. Southern Europeans, if you're Northern Europeans. This is the kind of stuff they do down there. English composer Robert Louis Purcell, for instance, resisted his compatriots' tendency to view the Iron Maiden as a sign of German depravity in particular, arguing Germans are not by nature cruel, to which he added, although in many circumstances they succumb to imitating bad examples. Clearly, in Purcell's assessment, all such satanic instruments of legal torture were the product of the Spanish Inquisition and the depraved monks who dreamt them up. And this is the so-called Black Legend, which the English really pushed, that the Spanish Catholics were the heart of everything wrong and cruel in the world. The backwardness and cruelty of the Middle Ages, after all, were well-established facts, and historical artifacts such as the Iron Maiden merely confirmed the prevalent Whig history of progress, in which Protestant England played the role of modern savior and progress. Hundreds of thousands of German and foreign tourists visited Nuremberg's torture chamber during the 19th century. I think this would be a great subject for a dissertation if somebody wants to do it, these criminal museums. How fitting that one of the curious spectators was the creator of what many people consider the greatest Gothic novel ever, thus bringing the circle to full completion. In 1885, while working as a secretary to the famous actor Sir Henry Irving, Bram Stoker recorded a fascinating visit to Goiters' torture collection in Nuremberg. There's Bram Stoker. While his employer rehearsed for a local performance of Faust, the 38-year-old Irishman, still 10 years away from publishing the masterpiece that would bring him international fame, Dracula, spent an entire afternoon perusing the Criminal Historical Museum and its artifacts. How he could spend hours there is beyond me. One item in particular fascinated him, the Iron Maiden, and he returned 8 years later on his own to make further observations of the dreaded device and its appropriately Gothic setting. Later that year, in 1893, Stoker published a short story called The Squaw. This is a German version. And there you see the Iron Maiden and the spikes and the blood and the black cat. Written in the first-person narrative, the story combines real and fantastic elements. While on a honeymoon trip to Germany with his wife, Stoker writes, the young couple encounters a boisterous American by the name of Elias P. Hutchinson, hailing from Isthmian City, Bleeding Gulch, Maple Tree County, Nebraska. Despite the stranger's over-the-top enthusiasm, Stoker and his wife greatly enjoy, quote, the racy remarks of our transatlantic friend, who from his quaint speech and his wonderful stock of adventures might have stepped out of a novel. That's some 19th century meta for you there. They agree to travel with him to Nuremberg and save their tour of the torture museum for the very end. As they walk along the city walls, and the city walls are still there. If you've been to Nuremberg, you can see them. They're massive city walls, and there's a big moat full of grass. As they walk along, Hutchison spies a black cat, and its kitten playing in the grassy moat beneath. Intending to frighten both, he tosses a stone in their direction, inadvertently killing the kitten. Hutcheson immediately apologizes to Stoker's wife, sorry ma'am, for the incident, but is otherwise untroubled as the angry mother cat futilely attempts to scale the moat's walls. "Oh, you must be very careful," Mrs. Stoker exclaims. "That animal would try to kill you if she were here. Her eyes look like positive murder." To which Hutcheson jovially replies, "Excuse me, ma'am, but I can't help a-laughing. Fancy man that has fought grizzlies and Injuns being careful of being murdered by a cat." Famous last words. Sure enough, this crime will come back to haunt Hutcheson when the trio subsequently visits the torture tower, a grim and gruesome place. I'm going to go back to that. There it is. Stoker pours on the atmosphere pretty thick, culminating with the group reaching the top of the tower. And I'm going to give you an extended quote, just so you can get a sense of his florid prose. "Round the chamber, placed in all sorts of irregular ways, were many implements of torture, which made one's heart ache to see. Chairs full of spikes, which gave instant and excruciating pain. Chairs and couches with dull knobs, whose torture was seemingly less, but which, though slower, were equally efficacious. Racks, belts, boots, gloves, collars, all made for compressing at will. Steel baskets, in which the head could be slowly crushed into a pulp if necessary. Watchman's hooks with long handle and knife that cut at resistance. This a specialty of the old Nuremberg police system, and many, many other devices for man's injury to man." So you see, those couple hours there were well spent, apparently. Stoker describes in still greater detail the central item of the collection, the Iron Maiden, which the American calls a squaw. Mrs. Stoker nearly faints at the sight, but she does a lot of fainting, but the intrepid Mr. Hutcheson boldly declares, "Yes, but I'll get in that box a minute just to see how it feels." Despite protests from his companions, the ebullient American bribes the museum's custodian to pull the maiden open with a rope pulley and then slowly let it close so that Hutcheson can feel the sensation of spikes coming toward him. The custodian, Stoker notes, must have had in him some of the blood of his predecessors in that ghastly tower, for he worked the engine with a deliberate and excruciating slowness, so that after 5 minutes, the outer edge of the door had not moved half as many inches. Suddenly, you may have foreseen this, the angry black cat appears and leads Hutcheson to more joking and bravado. Inexplicably, though, one might even say uncannily, the cat springs at the face of the custodian, who recoils and drops the rope, leading the iron door of the maiden to slam closed on our poor American cousin. Stoker's wife immediately faints. And when the writer wrenches open the maiden's door, he sees, I love this, happily the end was quick. The spikes had done their work and had pierced so deep that they had locked in the bones of the skull through which they had crushed, and actually tore it out of his iron prison, till bound as he was, he fell at full length with a sickly thud upon the floor, the face turning upward as he fell. Slightly dramatic. After Stoker tends to his wife, he turns to see, quote, sitting on the head of the poor American was the cat, purring loudly as she licked the blood which trickled through the gashed socket of his eyes. I think no one will call me cruel because I seized one of the old executioner's swords and sliced her in two as she sat. By the time of Stoker's story, Nuremberg's torture collection itself had moved to a more prominent location in the Imperial Castle. This was big money. In 1899, it was purchased by Lord Shrewsbury of London and sent on an extended tour of Great Britain and North America, including the Chicago World's Fair. Now, who doesn't want to see these medieval cruelties? Meanwhile, more popular literary works on executioners continued to appear, and in 1913, a new edition of the Schmidt Journal was published. Still using the wrong manuscript, though. Eventually, the Iron Maiden, together with assorted thumbscrews, shackles, executioner swords, and other items, many of them high-quality 19th century forgeries, were auctioned off to private collectors, including businessmen in Honolulu, Baltimore, and Niagara Falls, with the remaining items in Nuremberg's Imperial Castle destroyed during the Allied aerial bombing of the city on January 2nd, 1945. By then, the story of barbaric medieval justice and its sadistic executioners was a well-entrenched part of Western culture. Just as earlier generations had made use of the stereotype to degrade their own enemies, the American journalist Charles R. Beard wrote in 1941 of the Iron Maiden that this deadly machine and its mechanized, inflexible, and spineless execution of the bloody will of despotic men is a symbol of the German people, not just in the past, but also in the present. The bloodthirsty butchers of the Inquisition and secret Germanic courts had been succeeded in the American and British imagination by the Gestapo and other Nazi villains. The Gothic executioner wearing a different uniform lived on. The legend, in other words, had almost completely eclipsed the historical reality. And I always think of the end of the shooting of Liberty Valance. I don't know if you've seen this movie, but the journalists, they find out things weren't exactly as they thought they were. And the journalist says, when it comes between the legend and the reality, print the legend. More than any of his contemporaries, the medieval executioner remains the victim of modern condescension and disgust. He has become a self-serving affirmation of the modern world's collective social progress, the very symbol of a barbarous and ignorant past. In distancing Meister Franz and his fellow executioners from ourselves, we make them safe figures from the world of fairy tales, perpetrators of horrors that cannot touch us, revealing more about our own fears and dreams than the world we have inherited from them. We view the hooded caricature of modern popular culture with the same patronizing amusement as adults watching children at play or fighting, all the time confident of our own superior rationality and sophistication. But is such emotional, intellectual distancing justified? Here's my sermon part. It's very short, I promise you. Surely it is not edifying, at least in terms of any genuine understanding of past individuals and societies. I think there's a temptation to always use the past for our own purposes. Contrary to self-serving narratives of the civilizing process or gradual conscience formation among later generations, pre-modern Europeans, including executioners, do not appear to have been more prone to fear and hatred or less prone to compassion than those of us in the 21st century. It would have surprised Meister Franz, who so closely identified with the victims of crime, to hear his society characterized as especially cruel and heartless, particularly once he learned of such unthinkable modern atrocities as genocide, nuclear obliteration, and total war. He would admit that the criminal justice of his day could be harsh, but he would recoil at the notion of trials and incarcerations that extended for years, even decades, sometimes involving long periods of isolation. Pre-modern Europeans thought prison was cruel and inhuman, to lock somebody up in a small space. Better to either release them or punish them. They did not use prisons as a means of punishment. The pre-modern execution itself, which in films is typically characterized as a carnivalesque savoring of human suffering, and I think we've all seen this in movies, in fact offers the strongest repudiation of some qualitative shift in popular attitudes. Contrary to the popular stereotype, it was the very cruelty of botched executions and its suffering that sometimes upset spectators to the point of mob retaliation against the executioner. So these were not necessarily people who reveled in suffering and cruelty any more than people today. And I don't think you have to look very far in the newspapers to see examples of things today. There is no defense imaginable for such inhuman violations as execution with the wheel and judicial torture. But we must recognize that neither was primarily motivated by either mass sadism or pervasive indifference to the sufferings of others. What then? It is not our heightened sensitivity to human suffering that separate us from the pre-modern executioner's world. I think emotionally, people are not that different. but two specific historical developments, one practical and one conceptual. Medieval and early modern judicial mechanisms were, by our standards, woefully ineffective. Without modern investigative capabilities, modern technology, modern alternatives to banishment, like prison, medieval and early modern legal authorities felt compelled to rely on self-incrimination and thus torture, as well as capital punishment for a variety of serious and recidivist offenses. They didn't know what else to do when people kept stealing and kept doing things and kept coming back. And this, I'm not justifying it, I'm just saying it's a structural thing. It's not because they were especially cruel. Popular fear and magistrates' concerns about their own authority required some official punishment for those few perpetrators unlucky enough to get caught. They wanted to make an example. Frontier-style justice was often the result, preferable to lynch mob actions, but prone to coercion and other procedural shortcuts. They don't catch most people, and most people know that. So when they do catch somebody, they want to make a real example. Confession and self-incrimination are still valuable evidence today, and sometimes the cause of coercive police measures. But we have many other ways of accumulating evidence of culpability that law enforcement officials, then law enforcement officials did in pre-modern Europe. So that's one structural reason. The second, even more fundamental distinction between most developed societies today and pre-modern Europe is the notion of inalienable human rights. This other relatively late development in the public sphere, though still contested, provides at least a theoretical and legal basis for limiting state coercion and violence, even in the pursuit of justice. I have certain rights as a person. Authoritarian regimes of the past and the present, I'm not mentioning any by name, recognize no such externally imposed restrictions, nor did they place the sovereignty of the individual on par with the sovereignty of the state. State reason comes first. Meister Franz would have agreed that even apprehended criminals had a right to due process, but the idea that this right included protection of their bodies following incriminating evidence or conviction would have been an incomprehensible concept. Nuremberg's magistrates and their executioner strove for moderation, consistency, and even religious redemption, all in the face of widespread pressure for simple revenge. But abolishing, rather than moderating and standardizing state violence, was too much of an intellectual jump for them. They just could not imagine that you could really punish without using violence. The leap backwards for us, by contrast, is neither long nor inconceivable. Methodological and technological improvements have produced less of a stable or fundamental gap between pre-modern and modern developed societies than we would like to admit. Neither death by the wheel nor burning at the stake appears likely to make a comeback in the near future, we hope. But rises in criminality anywhere, real or perceived, still reliably generate popular cause for less constrained means of investigation and harsher punishments of convicted felons. We have a recent example of the mass incarceration movement of the 1990s. More punishment. Many modern regimes still employ systematic torture, and other governments, including our own at times, have deliberately blurred the line between acceptable and unacceptable coercion during interrogations. Capital punishment is still practiced in 58 countries, most prolifically in China and Iran, where it's in the thousands, but also in self-proclaimed liberal democracies such as the United States and Japan. Fear of violent attack and frustration with inadequate law enforcement, which is completely understandable and justifiable, appear to be not only constant in human history, but ever on the verge of devolving into overwhelming passions, especially when fueled by the less admirable human lust for retribution, which I think we all still have. Legal abstractions such as human rights remain relative newcomers, vulnerable to characterization as disposable luxuries in difficult times, easily outmatched by older, more entrenched, even primal urges. Should we be encouraged by the greater limitations on state violence since the days of the so-called medieval executioner, or disheartened by the fragility of our achievement? I happen to believe that progress can at the same time be genuine and fragile. That go on the online too. I was just coming to the end. I happen to believe that progress can be at the same time genuine and fragile. The pre-modern individuals who administered and conducted or tortured interrogations and public executions on behalf of their communities were not quite so different from us as we would like to believe. This is one of my arguments. Human nature, especially the proclivity to violence, has changed very little in my opinion. That is what makes our collective denunciation of what medieval torturers did so powerful, as long as we remember both our legal advances and our own continuing vulnerability to the same fears and the same justifications that motivated the people from the European past. Thank you. Little plug for my book. So I guess now we go to questions.